Have we become too confident in our own strength to notice when God is trying to warn us? In moments of crisis, when the ground beneath us trembles and the systems we trust begin to falter, our first instinct is often to look outward, to blame governments, leaders, even foreign nations. But what if this is not just a political disruption? What if this is a divine interruption? Jesus once told his followers, "He who has ears, let him hear," not just to listen but to truly perceive what is unfolding beneath the surface. In Matthew 24, he spoke of wars, rumors of wars, nations rising against nations. But he also reminded us that these things must happen as part of a greater unveiling. Today, as the United States stands exposed with its coastlines left vulnerable and Mexico halting strategic support without warning, many are quick to ask, what does this mean for national security? But perhaps the more urgent question is, what is God trying to show us through this? In a world obsessed with power, alliances, and military might, we often forget that the most decisive battles aren't fought on land or sea, but in the spirit. America's strength has never truly been its weapons or technology. It was built on values, on covenants, on the whispers of prayer rooms, and the cries of intercession. The real foundation wasn't steel and oil, it was faith. So when a close ally like Mexico withdraws support in such a critical moment, it shakes more than just defense protocols. It forces us to look deeper, to reflect, to return. Could this breach be a spiritual signal? A wake-up call to a generation that's drifted from God's covering? Could the breakdown of trust between nations mirror the broken trust between people and their Creator? We are reminded of Psalm 127:1. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. How many watchmen have stayed awake in vain lately? How many strategies have we built without asking for divine wisdom first? When Jesus walked among men, he spoke not only of salvation, but of discernment. He warned his disciples to understand the signs of the times, not to panic but to prepare, not in fear but in faith. What we are witnessing now may appear to be a simple geopolitical fallout, a shift in military cooperation. But beneath the headlines lies something more spiritual, more urgent and more eternal. It is in moments like these that God often calls his people back to prayer, back to dependence, back to the place where faith isn't just a word, it's the only thing that sustains us. We often ask, why is this happening? But maybe the better question is, Lord, what are you saying to us through this? Are we being invited to return to the altar, to rebuild what was lost not in strategy, but in spirit? Because as Jesus taught in Matthew 7, the wise man builds his house on the rock. And when the winds blow and the waves rise, that house will not fall, because it's built on something greater than alliances or submarines. It's built on truth. And maybe, just maybe, what looks like vulnerability on the outside is God preparing to rebuild something stronger on the inside. So today, as we begin to uncover what's truly happening, not just in global politics but in the spiritual atmosphere, we want to take a moment together to pray. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple but powerful. Would you leave a prayer in the comments below? Maybe it's a prayer for your country. Maybe it's for your family. Maybe it's for your own heart to stay rooted in truth during uncertain times. Whatever it is, write it. Speak life into this digital space. Because prayer isn't just something we do in silence. It's warfare. It's intercession. It's how we align ourselves with heaven's perspective when the world feels upside down. Jesus said in Matthew 18:20, "For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them." Imagine the power of hundreds, even thousands of us praying together, right here, right now, a digital upper room, a global moment of intercession. We're not here to spread fear. We're here to awaken faith. We're going to pray together in this video. But before we do, I want to ask you to support this message. If this speaks to your spirit, give this video a like. It helps more people who need this word to find it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We don't just talk about headlines. We discern the times through the lens of Jesus' truth. We're building a community that watches, prays, and stays rooted in the Word. So go ahead, drop your prayer below. Be bold. Don't hold back. Someone might read your words and be strengthened today. The silent break. When Mexico cut the line, it didn't begin with sirens or explosions. There were no warning shots, no dramatic press conferences, and no high-ranking officials pounding podiums. It started instead with silence, a quiet but deliberate halt. Mexico, America's immediate neighbor and long-standing strategic partner, chose a moment of stillness to send a message louder than words. The flow of key submarine components, support, and maritime cooperation to the United States would stop. No immediate explanation, no negotiations, just a closed gate. To most people, this wouldn't even register. Who thinks of Mexico when discussing U.S. submarines? The assumption is that America's military might is self-sufficient, unshakable, immovable. But in the world of defense logistics, the truth is far more intricate and far more fragile. Over the past decade, a subtle yet essential dependence had formed. U.S. naval systems, especially in terms of rapid component delivery, repair logistics, and discrete testing operations, had grown intertwined with Mexican ports and manufacturing corridors. Not publicized, not politicized, but real. That's what made the shutdown so devastating. It wasn't about hardware alone. It was about trust. For years, unspoken understandings had kept the machinery of defense cooperation running. Now, with one decision, Mexico snapped a vital thread in the web of U.S. maritime readiness. Some call it a move of sovereignty. Others suspect external influence. But either way, Washington was left blinking in confusion, as if waking from a dream it didn't realize it was having. What's striking is how little the public understands about these kinds of dependencies. Submarine dominance isn't just built in dry docks. It's maintained in the shadows, in overlooked supply chains, in handshake deals made far from cameras. And Mexico, with its growing technological capability and proximity, had become more than a neighbor. It was a silent partner in America's underwater advantage. But something shifted. Some say it was political, an accumulation of friction over immigration, energy, and drug policy. Others whisper of darker forces, global powers exerting subtle pressure through trade, debt, and diplomacy. And while the theories multiply, one reality remains clear. The U.S. Navy was left exposed, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the kind of vulnerability that keeps defense officials awake at night. Silent, creeping, and systemic. There's also a spiritual layer to this story, one most commentators ignore. In moments of sudden disruption, people often ask, what went wrong? But a deeper question might be, what was being ignored? In Scripture, God often used neighboring nations to stir his people, to remind them, to humble them. Could this unexpected breach be more than just a political ripple? Could it be a divine shakeup, forcing a nation to re-examine what it's truly built upon? Because America's foundations weren't just military, they were spiritual. The prayers of its people, the pulpits that once thundered with conviction, the hands that once lifted not just weapons, but worship. Somewhere along the way, the nation became comfortable with its strength, but history and the Word reminds us, every empire that forgets its source eventually finds its weakness. What makes this moment even more striking is the timing. At a point when global tension is rising, alliances are shifting, and spiritual warfare feels almost tangible. A quiet rupture like this can speak louder than explosions. It's not the storm that always reveals the cracks. It's the pressure before the storm. There's something deeply prophetic in how God moves through nations. We may see a diplomatic standoff, but in the spirit it may be an alarm bell, and not just for America, for believers everywhere, to rise, to pray, to see beyond headlines, to intercede for wisdom in the halls of power and humility in the hearts of leaders. Because the enemy doesn't always attack with fire. Sometimes he unplugs a connection, removes a covering, creates division where there once was unity. And if God's people aren't discerning, they might mistake sabotage for strategy, or overlook a warning wrapped in stillness. As we continue through this unfolding story, don't just follow the facts, follow the signs. Look deeper. Ask God for eyes to see and ears to hear. And if this moment stirred something in you, if it made you feel the weight of what's truly at stake, I want to hear from you in the comments. Leave a comment with the words, "I'm watching and praying," or simply write a prayer for discernment, for your nation, for the leaders, and for yourself. We're not just talking politics. We're talking prophecy, cracks beneath the surface, the vulnerability no one dared to see. The moment Mexico stepped back, it wasn't just a logistical disruption, it was a revelation. A crack was exposed, not in metal or policy, but in perception. For too long, there's been a collective illusion surrounding the United States military apparatus, that it's untouchable, sealed, and self-reliant. But just like any structure left unexamined for too long, the integrity begins to fade. not from the outside in, but from the inside out. And now, with a single unexpected decision from a neighboring nation, the facade has started to tremble. While analysts scramble to offer rational explanations and news outlets chase headlines and political angles, those who are spiritually awake feel something deeper rumbling. Because in moments like this, it's not about the submarine components or port access alone, it's about what those details uncover about where we truly stand. We're not just watching a moment of diplomatic tension, we're witnessing a peeling back of layers, a forced look in the mirror. Think about it. How many times has society grown so comfortable in systems that we stopped questioning their fragility? Tech giants, financial institutions, even supply chains. We've built our confidence on complexity, not resilience. And now, the defense of a superpower feels the ripple of a single decision made across the border. That ripple reveals something the world wasn't ready to admit. We are connected in ways we've refused to acknowledge. This isn't just about geopolitics. It's a spiritual metaphor. We assume we're protected because the shell looks strong, but what lies beneath has been neglected. Just like in our personal lives, we often ignore the warning signs. We see the cracks in our relationships, in our faith, in our priorities, but we keep moving, convincing ourselves that the outside strength will carry us through. But what if God is allowing these interruptions to force our attention inward, toward the cracks we dared not see? Mexico's move wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but that's what makes it so alarming. It exposed how vulnerable strength becomes when it's propped up by assumptions. And that lesson goes far beyond military alliances. It reaches into churches, families, businesses, even our own spiritual walk. We think we're solid until something subtle shakes us. A small fracture, a silent withdrawal, and suddenly everything feels exposed. There's also something eerily symbolic in the fact that this disruption affects the seas. Water in Scripture often symbolizes both chaos and divine movement. The seas are where Jonah ran from his calling. They're where Peter walked and sank. They're where Jesus calmed the storm and rebuked the winds. And now, the sea is where the U.S. faces a quiet unraveling of its naval confidence. What message lies beneath those waters? Many believers are sensing it. A shift, a pause, not just politically, but prophetically. And while some are quick to look for someone to blame, those who walk in discernment know that blame is a distraction. The real invitation here is to examine, to repent, to re-anchor. Because if Mexico's silence has taught us anything, it's that strength without surrender to God is never secure. And isn't it ironic? The very submarines designed to operate in stealth have now become the symbol of an exposed weakness. What was meant to glide beneath radar is now headline material. That's not just irony. It's divine poetry. Because God has a way of flipping scripts and forcing nations and individuals to confront what they've ignored. And so we have to ask ourselves, not just as citizens but as believers, have we placed too much trust in machinery and not enough in the Maker? Have we prayed more for protection than for perspective? Have we asked God to bless strategies He never authored? This is where the narrative gets uncomfortable, because it's easier to talk about diplomacy than discipline, easier to analyze decisions than to humble ourselves in prayer. But if this moment has stirred something inside you, if it's made you rethink what security really means, then that discomfort is the beginning of awakening, not fear, awareness. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. Maybe God is using this exact moment, not to shame or punish, but to redirect, to bring a nation to its knees not in defeat, but in prayer, to remind us that without Him, even the strongest vessels drift. If you're still watching this video, I know you're not here by accident. You feel it too. That stirring, that sense that something bigger is unfolding. Maybe you've seen cracks in your own life recently. Maybe you've sensed a divine pull to refocus, to rebuild, to return. If that's you, I want you to write something in the comments right now to break the silence. Write the words, "I see the cracks," or share what this moment is making you realize about your life, your faith, your nation. The more we speak, the more light we shine into places that have gone unseen for too long. Whispers of alignment. Is Mexico walking away or walking towards someone else? The silence that followed Mexico's decision to halt all submarine support to the United States wasn't just a void. It became an echo chamber for speculation, but not the kind of wild guesses that come from the public's imagination. These whispers have weight. They come from behind closed doors, from diplomatic corridors, from defense briefings where cell phones are left outside. The question hanging in the air is not simply, why did Mexico withdraw? But who is Mexico aligning with now? The timing is far from random. In a world being rapidly reshaped by new economic alliances, resource wars, and ideological clashes, a vacuum doesn't stay empty for long. And as one door closes with the United States, there's growing evidence that another may be opening with powers whose interests are not only different, but dangerously opposed. You can feel it, like a pressure shift before a storm. Mexico, long considered a passive neighbor, is starting to look more like a wild card in a global realignment. Analysts are beginning to pick up patterns: discrete trade summits, shifts in diplomatic language, military observers noting an uptick in non-NATO dialogue. Even infrastructure projects that once seemed purely commercial are now under scrutiny for their potential dual-use capabilities. When a country begins to invest heavily in its own ports, in advanced shipbuilding, and in cybersecurity networks with foreign code architecture, it signals more than progress. It signals preparation. And here's where things get even more interesting. China and Russia, both known for their long-game strategies, have historically courted nations not by confrontation, but by economic seduction. Loans, infrastructure, energy, promises of sovereignty without Western strings attached. Could Mexico be the next node in a growing network of quiet resistance to U.S. dominance? If so, the submarine shutdown wasn't just a logistical move, it was a declaration. Quiet, but clear. It's the kind of shift that doesn't make the evening news but keeps intelligence agencies on high alert. Because when proximity meets unpredictability, you no longer have the comfort of distance. And if a nation like Mexico begins to pivot toward new alliances, the implications aren't regional, they're continental. The idea of a unified Western Hemisphere under U.S. influence starts to fracture. And with that fracture comes exposure. But let's go deeper. Because everything that happens in the visible world has a parallel in the invisible. This isn't just about treaties and hardware. It's about spirit. It's about loyalty, influence, identity. The same way an individual can drift from truth one small decision at a time, nations, too, can be seduced by the promise of independence while walking into entanglement. Scripture tells us to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves, not paranoid, but perceptive. And if we're watching closely, this is not just a political pivot. It's a spiritual redirection, one that may carry consequences far beyond defense strategies. History teaches us that no empire ever falls from a single blow. It unravels slowly, thread by thread, through compromises that once seemed harmless, through alliances that seemed profitable, through silence that was misread as stability. And in the spiritual realm, we know this too. The enemy rarely attacks head-on. He whispers. He distracts. He offers a new path just slightly off course until suddenly you're facing the wrong direction entirely. And maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe Mexico isn't just pulling away, it's being pulled. Maybe it's not only about breaking ties with the United States, but about being tied to something else. And that should make us all pause. Because when proximity becomes unpredictability, we can no longer afford to see nations only as dots on a map. We have to see them as players in a much bigger game. There's also a psychological shift taking place. For decades, the U.S. operated from a position of assumed loyalty from its neighbors. That assumption is now cracked. And with that crack comes not only military vulnerability, but emotional confusion. It's like when someone you trusted suddenly changes their tone. Before you even understand what happened, you're already behind. That's the danger here. Not just the potential alliance Mexico may be stepping into, but the shockwave of realizing that an ally may no longer share your vision. This is why discernment is everything in this hour, not just for governments, but for us, for those watching, for those praying, for those who understand that every geopolitical shift carries a spiritual pulse. We need to be asking the hard questions, not just about military readiness, but about readiness of the heart. Because what good is a submarine fleet if the soul of a nation is adrift? And so I want to hear from you. If you've been sensing this shift, if something in your spirit is stirring, write the phrase, "I'm watching the realignment" in the comments. Or tell me what you believe is truly happening beneath the surface of these global moves. Let's not just observe history, let's discern it together. The unseen hand, pressure, debt, and the power behind the silence. When a nation shifts direction suddenly, especially one as historically interwoven with the United States as Mexico, there's usually more beneath the surface than what any official statement reveals. The halt in submarine support may have looked like a clean-cut decision, But nothing of this scale happens in isolation. To understand why Mexico would risk disrupting decades of defense cooperation with its largest trade partner, you have to follow the pressure. And pressure doesn't always come from threats. It often comes through economics, dependency, and quiet influence. It comes through debt, through favors, through opportunities that appear too strategic to turn down. It comes through the unseen hand. In recent years, China has not only expanded its influence through military drills or diplomatic rhetoric, it's done so through a slow, methodical financial strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just about ports and railways, it's about leverage. And now it seems that Mexico may be another page in that global playbook. Billions in promised investment, infrastructure projects wrapped in mutual growth language, and technology deals that slip under the radar because they're signed in conference rooms, not parliaments. It's not warfare, it's web building. And the moment a nation steps too deep into the web, its decisions no longer belong fully to itself. We must ask the uncomfortable question: what if Mexico's silence is not of its own making? What if this halt in cooperation with the U.S. wasn't initiated internally, but influenced externally, guided by powers that see America's naval vulnerability as a strategic advantage? Because there's a growing pattern. From Latin America to Africa to Southeast Asia, nations are pivoting away from traditional alliances, not always because they want to, but because saying no is no longer an option once the money is on the table and the contracts are signed. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous is not just Mexico's proximity, but the historical assumption that its loyalty could be counted on. That assumption no longer holds. In the background, subtle economic deals with Chinese tech firms have begun integrating into Mexico's telecommunications infrastructure. Ports once designed for commercial trade are being quietly upgraded to accommodate heavier, more complex logistics, dual-use capabilities that, if examined through a military lens, raise more than a few eyebrows. Russia, too, has played its cards carefully, less visible, more targeted. Energy partnerships, intelligence exchanges, and a narrative campaign across Latin America designed to present the West, especially the United States, as a fading empire clinging to old dominance. And when you shape perception long enough, decisions begin to shift quietly in your favor. You don't need to start a war. You just need to make people believe they no longer need their old allies. And all of this, every whisper, every deal, every infrastructure upgrade, leads us back to this moment. The moment when Mexico stopped the flow of something seemingly small but symbolically massive: submarine parts, naval components, on the surface replaceable, but in reality they signal a break in rhythm, a fracture in confidence. They tell the world, the old rules are changing, and for those paying attention they also ask, are you ready for what comes next? But let's not ignore the spiritual undercurrent in all this, because when something of this magnitude happens without explanation, when the natural seems too calculated to be coincidence, we must lean in with discernment. Scripture teaches us to be watchful, not just reactive, to perceive the times, to understand when the enemy operates not with noise but with precision. This is one of those moments, and if the church doesn't speak into it, the void will be filled with confusion, fear, and manipulation. It's no longer enough to just pray for peace. We must also pray for clarity, for revelation, that every hidden agreement, every unholy alliance, every manipulation behind the curtain be exposed. Because if Mexico has fallen under the influence of powers who seek to weaken not only the U.S., but the spiritual fabric of the West, then what's happening now is not just a national shift, it's a spiritual shaking. And perhaps this is exactly where God is calling his people: into awareness, into intercession, into boldness. Because while world leaders sit behind microphones and talk strategy, the true battle is being fought in silence, in prayer rooms, in midnight hours, in the hearts of people who refuse to bow to fear. If you've felt that this isn't just politics, if you've sensed that something much deeper is happening, write the words, "Unseen forces are moving" in the comments. Or tell me what part of this revelation stirred something in your spirit. This isn't just content. This is a call to stay awake. Strategic silence. Why the most dangerous moves make no noise. The most dangerous shifts in global power don't begin with explosions or declarations. They begin in silence, in quiet decisions made away from cameras, in brief moments of hesitation that seem insignificant to the world, but seismic to those who understand timing, influence, and leverage. When Mexico abruptly ceased its cooperation with the U.S. submarine program, the world barely flinched. There were no dramatic headlines screaming collapse, but silence, true strategic silence, is rarely empty. It's loaded. It speaks of coordination, of decisions made far earlier than the public was allowed to see, and now that silence has grown into something impossible to ignore. It's important to realize that in geopolitics, what isn't said is often more powerful than what is. Mexico's refusal to offer a direct explanation, to give any diplomatic framing or public rationale, has forced intelligence communities and spiritual observers alike to read between the lines. That kind of silence is surgical. It doesn't provoke, it unsettles. It leaves your opponent guessing. And when your adversary is guessing, you've already gained an advantage. Within the defense circles of Washington, the silence is being interpreted not as confusion, but as intent. They know that a move like this, at this level of coordination, does not happen without multiple players being informed in advance. This is not a protest. It's a message. The absence of noise becomes the noise itself, like a chess player lifting a piece without making the move yet, keeping everyone on edge, trying to calculate the next step before it happens. At the spiritual level, this silence also carries a warning. There's a principle throughout Scripture that God often uses silence not to hide but to prepare. Think of the years of silence between the Old and New Testaments. God wasn't absent. He was aligning everything for the coming of Christ. Silence in the natural can mean movement in the supernatural. And what we're seeing now is not a pause in activity, it's a concealed acceleration. You see, when nations begin to change posture silently, when alliances shift without press releases, we are no longer watching politics. We're watching warfare in its most evolved form: psychological, economic, cultural. And for those who are spiritually awake, this moment feels eerily familiar. There's a sensation like the calm before a storm, when everything looks still on the surface, but deep beneath, massive currents are rearranging the seafloor. And let's be clear, this is not about demonizing Mexico. It's about recognizing that a power vacuum is always filled, and if traditional partnerships weaken, others will gladly step in. That's the game now. The United States, for all its strength, has entered a period where assumptions can no longer be relied upon. The assumption that neighbors will always cooperate. The assumption that logistical networks are secure. The assumption that alliances are permanent. All of that is now under question, and it's that uncertainty, crafted in silence, that creates the perfect environment for outside influence to take root. From a psychological standpoint, silence also rewires the mind. It breaks rhythm. It causes people to second guess. Diplomats are trained to manage dialogue. But when there is no dialogue, when a familiar player suddenly disengages, the panic isn't loud, it's internal. It causes delays, mistakes, and overreactions. Strategic silence is a tool used by masters of timing. It's how you introduce fear without speaking. And in global strategy, fear often dictates policy more than logic does. But what's even more chilling is how normalized silence has become. We're in an age where disinformation thrives not through false statements but through withheld truth. People are so overwhelmed by content, by breaking news, by viral outrage, that when something goes silent, they miss it entirely. And the enemy knows this, both in the geopolitical and spiritual realms. He doesn't always need noise to move people. Sometimes he only needs to control what they don't hear. So while much of the world is distracted by louder crises, conflicts that burn bright and fast, this quiet maneuver in North America is being overlooked. But those with ears to hear know it matters. Because when a country that has long walked in step suddenly stops, it signals something deeper, a reassessment of identity, a reevaluation of allegiance. And when it happens without a word, it demands that we pay closer attention, not just to actions, but to atmospheres. And for the church, this is a moment to be alert, not panicked, but discerning, because the same principle applies in our personal walk with God. Sometimes the loudest spiritual battles happen during the quietest seasons, when prayers feel unanswered, when direction feels unclear, when everything slows just enough for God to draw our attention to the things we were too busy to notice. This silence on the world stage might just be a reflection of what He's doing in hearts across the globe, pulling back the noise so we can finally hear. If you're still with me, still tracking this thread, I want to hear from you. Write the phrase, "The silence says everything," in the comments, or tell me what you've been sensing during these quiet shifts. This isn't just about what was said, it's about what wasn't. The illusion of control. When strength becomes a mirage, there comes a point when a nation's greatest strength can quietly become its greatest illusion. That point is rarely recognized in the moment. It reveals itself through patterns, through unexpected interruptions, through cracks that don't announce themselves with explosions, but with subtle withdrawals. That's exactly what we're seeing now. The United States, long considered a beacon of unmatched military power and strategic dominance, is discovering the weight of misplaced confidence. Not because its technology failed, not because its weapons were inferior, but because the systems it believed were locked in place, loyalties, logistics, alignments, are proving to be more fluid than ever imagined. And when strength becomes something you assume, rather than something you maintain with humility, it turns into a mirage. Mexico's quiet disengagement is not simply about submarines. It's about the unsettling realization that power without proximity means very little. A nation can have the most sophisticated fleet, the most advanced command centers, and yet still be outmaneuvered by a shift in atmosphere. What once looked like strategic advantage is suddenly exposed as vulnerable, and that vulnerability begins with relationships, not resources. For years, the assumption was that geographical closeness guaranteed alignment, that because Mexico shared a border, a language of diplomacy, and years of trade, it would never step away. But that assumption was rooted in comfort, not clarity. And clarity is what's missing now. The illusion of control often comes wrapped in data, charts, reports, supply chain metrics that show everything is functioning. But behind the numbers are hearts, intentions, pressures, things you can't calculate. Trust isn't something you can measure with statistics, it's something that lives in the unspoken. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. Because when trust evaporates and the silence remains, you realize how fragile even the most robust systems can be. This is where the spiritual parallel becomes unavoidable. Because how many of us have lived under the illusion of control, believing that because things look stable, they are stable, that because our routines are intact, our hearts must be aligned. But the truth is, many live with cracks just beneath the surface, cracks in marriages, in faith, in direction. And like nations, those cracks don't show themselves until pressure is applied, until something shifts and reveals what we refuse to confront. Right now, the United States is facing one of those moments, a relational fracture that exposes a deeper truth. Global power is no longer about who has the biggest arsenal. It's about who can maintain influence without being noticed. It's about who can pull strings while others are still reading the script. And influence has shifted, not because of weakness, but because of distraction. While America debated culture wars and internal conflict, others were watching, calculating, aligning. And now, with a single move from Mexico, we're seeing the ripple effects. Trade routes being reassessed, defense strategies being rewritten, intelligence communities updating threat maps not based on firepower, but on trust erosion. It's not about war in the traditional sense, it's about perception, and perception has shifted. The image of unshakable control has been blurred, and once that image blurs, confidence begins to crumble. In Scripture, we're warned repeatedly not to put our faith in chariots or horses, but in the name of the Lord. That warning wasn't just poetic, it was prophetic, because God knew that human systems, no matter how strong they appear, are flawed at the root if they are not aligned with truth. And truth has a way of surfacing during disruption. Right now, what's surfacing is the undeniable need for recalibration, not just politically but spiritually, not just in military briefings but in prayer rooms. Because if we don't see this moment for what it really is, we risk rebuilding on faulty foundations. And here's where this connects deeply to those watching right now. Because this story isn't just about nations, it's about us. How many of us have lived assuming our plans were protected, our goals set, our resources sufficient, and yet, one unexpected shift, a loss, a betrayal, a delayed answer, suddenly reveals how little control we actually had. But that's not a reason to fear. It's a reason to return, to revisit the foundation, to remember who holds the real authority. Because when the illusion fades, truth can finally emerge. There is something liberating about seeing clearly, even when what you see is uncomfortable. And this moment, both globally and personally, is calling us out of assumption and into alignment, out of control and into surrender, out of illusion and into reality. And that's where revival begins, not when we feel secure, but when we realize we're not. and we fall to our knees not in despair, but in dependence. If this message has stirred something inside you, if you've ever felt that moment where the control you thought you had slipped right through your fingers, write the words, "I'm letting go of the illusion," in the comments. Or share a moment where you realized strength without surrender isn't strength at all. Let's speak truth together, even in the silence. A chain reaction. When one door closes, who walks in? What many don't understand about power vacuums is that they don't last long. The moment one relationship fractures, another begins to form, sometimes publicly, sometimes in shadow. The world doesn't function in stasis. Every political pause, every diplomatic silence, every severed supply line invites movement. And the real danger isn't what was lost when Mexico pulled away. It's who might be stepping into that newly opened space. Because when one door closes, you better believe someone's already waiting on the other side with a plan in hand. That's the phase we're entering now. A slow but undeniable shift where the absence of a familiar ally signals an opportunity for unfamiliar forces to stake their ground. When Mexico halted submarine collaboration with the United States, it didn't just create a gap in naval logistics. It opened up a strategic corridor, a space that others, nations with very different agendas, are watching carefully. And while the media may remain fixated on louder dramas, the quiet realignments are far more consequential. You don't need a military base to gain influence. All it takes is leverage, financial leverage, resource leverage, technological leverage. That's what China has perfected, and the reports are no longer whispers. They're data, infrastructure contracts being signed, communications networks subtly shifting to foreign-controlled platforms, training exchanges and joint development programs that bypass public scrutiny. These are not conspiracy theories. These are patterns. And those patterns are beginning to map a future in which Latin America's loyalty may no longer be tethered to Washington, but redirected toward Beijing's orbit. Russia, too, isn't watching idly. While its footprint is quieter in Mexico compared to other regions, it plays the long game. Strategic patience, influence through ideology, media, energy. Any tool that can reframe public opinion and position the United States as the oppressor, not the partner. And once that narrative takes hold, once trust begins to erode, every future collaboration becomes a negotiation, not an assumption. This is the new game. Not bombs and boots, but hearts and minds. And here's where we often miss it. Because while politicians debate and agencies scramble, the most important battles aren't happening at press briefings. They're happening in unseen rooms, over contracts and private conversations. They're happening in the shaping of perception. And whoever shapes the perception eventually shapes the policy. That's how influence works. It sneaks in while the world is distracted. It builds quietly, patiently, until one day it's not influence anymore. It's control. But let's take a step back, because this is not just about geopolitics. This is a mirror. It reflects something deeply human. How often do we close one door in our lives, whether through hurt, pride, or fear, and assume it will remain simply closed, untouched? But life doesn't work that way. When we walk away from one influence, another waits. When we shut out truth, lies come knocking. When we abandon discipline, distraction is always there to fill the void. It's never just about what we let go of. It's also about what we're letting in. This is what makes the current shift between Mexico and the U.S. not just a strategic concern, but a spiritual alarm. Because the question now isn't simply, why did Mexico step back? But who will now step forward? And that's a question we need to ask ourselves too. When we create space, through silence, disobedience, or even fatigue, what voices are we allowing to occupy it? Who is stepping into the space we once reserved for God's direction? You see, spiritual warfare doesn't just come through attack. Sometimes it comes through replacement, a subtle substitution of influences, a slow realignment of values. And by the time we notice the shift, the territory has already changed hands. That's what's happening now. Territories, literal and symbolic, are being redrawn, not with force, but with favor. And favor is being bought, not earned. That's the real war. And here's the wake-up call. If we don't fill the void with truth, the void will fill itself. That applies to nations. It applies to families. It applies to churches. We must be intentional with every space we create, because every decision to disengage, delay, or distract becomes an invitation to something else. And that something else doesn't always wear a label. It doesn't always announce its arrival. It just walks in, quietly, confidently, ready to take root. That's the moment we're standing in right now. A global pivot where what used to be certain is now fluid, where borders aren't just physical, they're relational, and where the next wave of power will belong to those who understood how to occupy silence with influence. That's what China and Russia understand. That's what many in the West are still waking up to. If this is resonating with you, if you've seen this principle play out not just on the news but in your own life, write in the comments. I will guard the space, or share how you've seen unexpected influences step in when something familiar stepped out. Let's keep this conversation alive. Echoes at the border. When geography is not enough for decades, proximity has been treated like a guarantee. There's been this unspoken belief that because two nations share a border, they will naturally share interests, priorities, and alliances. But geography is not loyalty. It's not vision. And what we're witnessing right now, with Mexico's quiet yet seismic repositioning away from the United States, is proof that maps don't determine allegiance. Mindsets do. The comforting narrative that the U.S. would always be protected by its northern and southern borders is being rewritten, not by military invasions or territorial disputes, but by slow, deliberate decisions that alter the very nature of regional trust. The border between the United States and Mexico has always been complex, layered with economic tension, cultural exchange, and security concerns. But buried beneath the headlines about immigration and trade wars lies something far more significant: a spiritual battle over alignment. Because borders may define physical space, but it's what crosses those borders, ideas, agreements, influences, that shapes the future. And the silence coming from Mexico today isn't just political restraint, it's a redefinition of what that shared space means. What's most alarming isn't the noise of enemies, it's the stillness of friends. You expect opposition from those who declare it, but when those who once stood with you start standing back, hesitation becomes its own kind of message. And right now, the hesitation is deafening. The submarine support halt was a symbol, a subtle but clear announcement that the assumptions of yesterday no longer hold weight today. And if you're paying attention, you can feel it. The atmosphere around the southern border has changed, not militarily, but relationally. It's no longer just a line on a map. It's a question mark, and questions are dangerous, especially when they go unanswered. Because in the absence of clarity, suspicion grows, doubt grows, and nations begin to act not based on facts, but on fear. The longer Mexico remains silent, the louder the strategic calculations become behind closed doors in Washington. If a border partner can shift this quietly, who else is reconsidering their position? And how quickly could those reconsiderations become realignments? This is not just a diplomatic chessboard, it's a prophetic moment. Because what's playing out on the world stage is a mirror of what's happening in the spiritual realm. People assume that proximity to truth equates to participation in truth, that being near a church means being part of the church, that growing up in a faith-based environment guarantees alignment with God's will. But just like nations, proximity does not equal loyalty. Just because you're close doesn't mean you're committed. And just because you're familiar doesn't mean you're faithful. This is where discernment becomes critical, not just for political analysts, but for believers. We cannot afford to assume that external appearances reflect internal convictions. We must listen not only to what is being said, but also to what isn't. Because when allies grow quiet, when hearts grow distant, when trust begins to leak through the cracks of once solid agreements, we are being invited to look deeper, to ask hard questions, to return to first foundations. The U.S.-Mexico relationship has long been treated as a given. But what if that given is now being reevaluated? What if years of policy strain, cultural conflict, and competing economic visions have slowly eroded what once looked like a solid foundation? And what if, beneath the surface, Mexico is not just stepping back, but stepping into a new identity, one that doesn't include the United States at its center? This is the danger of relying on geography alone. It lulls you into believing that closeness equals control. But just like in personal relationships, emotional distance can begin long before physical separation. A spouse can be in the same room, yet miles away in spirit. A friend can stand beside you, yet already be pulling away inside. Nations operate the same way, and we're watching it unfold right now. The challenge for the United States is not merely to restore logistics. It's to recognize the signs of relational drift. to confront the uncomfortable truth that history doesn't guarantee the future, to see that loyalty must be maintained, not assumed, and perhaps more urgently, to realize that the border is no longer just about territory, it's about trust, and trust, once broken, is hard to reclaim. Spiritually speaking, this moment should shake us, because it's not just a national shift, it's a personal call to evaluate where we've assumed closeness meant security, where we've mistaken routine for relationship, where we've grown numb to the signs of drift, thinking everything is fine simply because everything looks familiar. But just like borders, faith must be guarded, nurtured, renewed, or else the silence we once ignored will become the distance we cannot cross. If this is resonating with you, if you've ever experienced that subtle shift where closeness was replaced by confusion, write the words, "Proximity isn't commitment," in the comments. Or share how this moment is making you reflect on your own relationships, with people, with your nation, or with God. Let's keep digging deeper. The fracture within, when divided loyalties breed, national instability. The most dangerous fractures are the ones that form inside the walls, not the ones caused by enemies on the outside, but the ones birthed from internal tensions, competing loyalties, and silent compromises. That's what makes this moment in Mexico's geopolitical behavior so significant and so alarming. Because the decision to halt military cooperation with the United States, particularly in something as strategically sensitive as submarine technology, didn't come out of nowhere. It's not just a diplomatic pivot. It's the symptom of a deeper unrest, a fracture forming within Mexico's own identity, as it is pulled in multiple directions by economic ambitions, political realignments, and spiritual confusion. Mexico has always existed in a delicate balance. It's a nation shaped by history, scarred by colonial legacy, and challenged by modern pressures that stretch it between North and South, tradition and modernity, independence and influence. But the events now unfolding reveal something much more unstable, a country struggling to decide who it wants to be. And in that struggle, it has begun to allow outside forces to speak into its core decisions, forces that do not necessarily share the interests of the West or the democratic values it has long flirted with, but never fully embraced. And this isn't just political theater. This is spiritual tectonics. Because when a nation loses clarity on its identity, it becomes vulnerable to seduction, not just from foreign powers, but from ideologies, movements, and spiritual currents that promise strength while sowing division. The moment a nation begins to see its alliances not as a source of unity, but as a burden or a threat, the door opens for chaos to take root. What we're watching is not just Mexico taking a step back from the United States, it's Mexico questioning the very foundation of its geopolitical soul. And what follows that kind of questioning is rarely peaceful. This fracture isn't limited to Mexico. It's a mirror to something that's happening across the world, including within the United States itself. Divided loyalties are breeding instability. Internal polarization is weakening resolve. People and institutions are being pulled in opposite directions, by fear, by pride, by false narratives that play to pain instead of truth. And as these divisions grow, the enemy, whether political, ideological, or spiritual, doesn't have to knock down the door. He just waits for it to crack under the weight of confusion. That's what makes this submarine story more than just a military update. It's a signal flare, because in military strategy, submarines symbolize depth, secrecy, and precision. So when support for them collapses without explanation, it suggests more than logistical inconvenience. It suggests a deeper unraveling, one that begins in hidden places, a shaking not just of policy, but of purpose. And the silence around that collapse makes it even more chilling. Because when key decisions are made in silence, it's often because speaking would reveal more than anyone is ready to confront. We're entering an age where national identity is no longer anchored in shared values, but in shifting interests. And that's incredibly dangerous. Because without a clear anchor, the tides of global influence can carry a country wherever the current pulls strongest. And those currents don't care about history. They care about leverage, about access, about long-term control. That's what China understands. That's what Russia capitalizes on. They don't need to launch missiles when they can sow enough internal division for the nation to implode on its own. Spiritually, this applies to us too. How many of us live divided, saying we belong to one kingdom, but bowing to the pressures of another, trying to please both the crowd and the cross? When loyalty is split, authority is weakened. When the heart is not unified, confusion reigns. That's why Jesus said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." That wasn't just a moral lesson, it was a survival strategy. And right now, nations are ignoring it. People are ignoring it. And we're seeing the result in real time. The fracture within Mexico, and even within the US, is not about political parties or policy shifts. It's about a spiritual crisis of identity. And until that crisis is addressed, until people, and by extension governments, return to alignment with truth, every alliance will be temporary, every commitment conditional, and every promise fragile. That's the sobering reality we're watching unfold. Not just in the corridors of power, but in homes, in churches, in hearts that have grown accustomed to division instead of healing it. But the good news, the hope that keeps us steady, is that fractures can be repaired. Not by force, not by manipulation, but by truth, by the courage to see things as they are, by the willingness to repent and return. But that only happens when the silence is broken, when the questions are asked, when the people awaken. If you feel this on any level, if you've seen how divided loyalties have created instability in your nation, your community, or even your personal walk, write the words, "No more divided ground," in the comments. Or tell me how you've seen the cost of silence and inner conflict play out around you. Let's expose the fracture, so we can begin the work of healing. Beneath the surface, how spiritual disconnection shapes political decisions. There's always a layer beneath the one we see. Every political shift, every economic rupture, every sudden realignment of nations is almost always the symptom of something deeper, something unseen. And while most experts stop at analyzing military logistics, trade dependencies, or strategic alliances, those with discernment understand that the root often lies not in politics, but in the spirit. We are watching a world rewire itself, and at the center of it is not just a battle over geography or influence, but over identity, spiritual identity. The decisions made by governments don't exist in isolation. They are reflections of the spiritual atmosphere ruling over a nation. When that atmosphere is fractured, disconnected from its original purpose, the decisions follow suit. What appears to be policy is often the fruit of spiritual drought. Mexico's retreat from military partnership with the United States is not just a renegotiation of cooperation. It is the external evidence of internal realignment. And what's alarming is not the shift itself, but the silence that surrounds it. Silence is a sign. It tells us that something is being protected, hidden, or manipulated. But deeper still, it tells us that truth has become too inconvenient to speak out loud. This isn't just political pragmatism, it's spiritual disconnection. When a nation, a people, or a leader drifts from spiritual alignment, their decisions begin to follow logic divorced from wisdom, strategy without truth, action without discernment. And those decisions always carry consequences far beyond their original intent. We've seen this play out throughout history. When nations lose their moral compass, they begin to confuse influence with identity. They become easy prey for manipulation, for financial seduction, for the promise of sovereignty that is, in reality, submission to a darker agenda. The Bible is full of stories where leaders rejected divine direction in favor of political gain, only to find themselves enslaved by the very powers they once entertained. And yet, here we are again, watching Mexico, once a country oscillating between resistance and cooperation, now becoming a question mark on the geopolitical map. But that question mark is not just for diplomats to solve, it's a wake-up call for the spiritually awake. Because what's really happening beneath the surface is more than a defense disruption, it's a redirection of loyalty. And when loyalty is severed from truth, when allegiance is dictated by fear or flattery rather than conviction, nations lose more than allies. They lose themselves. And it starts slowly, with decisions that seem small, harmless, even justified. But those decisions compound. They create distance. And distance, when left unchecked, always becomes division. You don't wake up divided overnight. Division creeps in through moments of unguarded compromise. The same principle applies to our own lives. When we begin to disconnect spiritually, when our prayer life becomes routine, when our values are shaped more by culture than by conviction, when our time with God is squeezed into the leftover minutes of our schedule, we start making decisions that reflect that disconnection. We compromise, we rationalize, we move based on what's efficient instead of what's righteous. And eventually, like nations, we find ourselves aligned with forces that don't reflect who we truly are or what we're called to do. This is the real war beneath the headlines. It's not about submarines. It's about submission, not to a nation, but to a spirit. And the enemy doesn't need to wage war with tanks and missiles when he can shift atmospheres with confusion, distraction, and disconnection. That's why spiritual alignment is not optional in this hour. It's critical, because the cost of disconnection is always higher than it looks at first glance. It weakens discernment. It clouds vision. It makes leaders reactive instead of prophetic. And in that fog, decisions are made that redirect the future. Mexico's silence is a warning, not just about its loyalties, but about the nature of influence in this new era. Influence is no longer about strength, it's about clarity. It's about knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what you refuse to compromise. And that clarity only comes from alignment. Alignment with truth, with purpose, with the voice of God that doesn't shift with public opinion or geopolitical pressure. When that voice is no longer present in the decision-making of a nation, the noise of alternative voices grows louder, and eventually those voices take control. If we don't see this moment through spiritual eyes, we will miss what's truly being fought for. This isn't about who controls the seas. It's about who controls the spirit of a nation. It's about whether decisions will be made in boardrooms or in prayer rooms. And if we want to shape the future, we must start by confronting what we've allowed to shape us. If this word has pierced something in your spirit, if you've felt the effects of spiritual disconnection either personally or in your nation, write the phrase, "I choose alignment," in the comments. Or share how this message is helping you see beyond the headlines. Let's keep pulling back the veil, because the surface never tells the whole story. The shift in the winds, discerning the invisible momentum of nations. You can always tell when something is about to change, not by what people say, but by what begins to move in the atmosphere. Before the tides turn, before the headlines shift, before the analysts catch up, there's a subtle change in momentum, like a shift in the winds that only those paying close attention can feel. Right now, that's exactly what we're witnessing across the geopolitical landscape. And nowhere is it more evident than in the unfolding repositioning between the United States and Mexico. It's not just about defense collaboration or political strategy anymore. It's about an invisible realignment happening on a much deeper level, where spiritual, economic, and ideological forces collide. And those who fail to discern that momentum will find themselves reacting to events that they should have been preparing for long before they arrived. What's happening isn't sudden. It's been brewing quietly for years. The erosion of trust didn't happen overnight, and the cracks didn't form from a single decision. What we're seeing now is the visible surface of a deeper undercurrent, a buildup of delayed consequences, overlooked warnings, and spiritual negligence. And just like with natural winds, the shift began long before the storm clouds became visible. It's easy to feel safe when the skies are clear, but the wise know that movement in the air means something is coming, something that changes the landscape, something that can no longer be ignored or dismissed. Mexico's disengagement from submarine support to the United States was not just a change in logistics. It was a pressure release, a signal that the alignment of old no longer holds the weight it once did. The U.S. believed its neighbors were bound by history, by convenience, by shared struggles. But history, convenience, and even shared struggle can be reinterpreted when the winds begin to blow in a new direction. And that's what's happening. Mexico is sensing an opportunity to reimagine itself, not as an auxiliary power dependent on the North, but as a sovereign force capable of shaping its own alliances, its own trade corridors, even its own ideology. But what makes this moment so urgent is not the act of redefinition itself. It's who is helping shape that redefinition. Because in a vacuum of clear purpose, louder influences always step in. China, with its methodical patience and infrastructure diplomacy, has already been laying down relational foundations far beyond trade. Russia, with its media narratives and quiet subversion, is playing the long game, whispering stories of American decline to whoever will listen. These are not theories, they are tactics, psychological, economic, and deeply spiritual. And Mexico, caught in the middle of its own identity crossroads, is becoming a focal point of this invisible contest. This is not the first time a nation has been courted by powers offering promises of freedom while trading sovereignty for support. The Bible is filled with examples: Babylon, Egypt, Assyria, empires that gained control not just through armies, but through influence. They knew the power of momentum. They knew that you don't need to crush a nation from the outside if you can seduce it from within. And that's what makes spiritual discernment so critical right now, not just for leaders but for citizens, for intercessors, for anyone willing to look beyond the narrative and listen for the sound of the wind, because there's something being stirred. The Spirit is allowing a shaking, a stirring in the atmosphere, not to create panic, but to awaken clarity. If Mexico's silence and subtle pivot feels heavy, it's because it is, not in terms of military consequence alone, but because it reveals the fragility of alliances that were never rooted in spiritual alignment to begin with. And that's the part most people miss. Real unity isn't just built on treaties or trade. It's built on shared values, shared truth, shared humility. Without that, any agreement is temporary. Any friendship is fragile. And here's where it hits closer to home. Because if we're honest, we've all felt this wind in our own lives. That moment when you can't quite explain it, but something is changing. The doors you expected to open suddenly close. The people you trusted begin to fade. The plans you were sure of now seem unstable. It's the same wind, the same invisible shift that moves not just around nations but through our personal lives as well. It's not always a punishment. Sometimes it's a preparation. God allows the wind to shift so that what is not grounded in Him is blown away, not to harm us, but to purify us, to protect us from building on foundations that cannot hold. If you've felt this momentum in your own life, or if you've been watching these global shifts and sensing something deeper than politics, write the phrase, "I can feel the wind shifting," in the comments. Or share a moment when God allowed something to shift in your life to prepare you for something greater. This is more than a conversation. It's a call to awareness, to readiness, and to spiritual depth. Because when the winds change, only what's rooted will remain. The quiet invasion. Influence without war, control without noise. We were trained to look for conflict in the form of fire. We expect power struggles to erupt with noise, missiles, troops, declarations. But what we've failed to understand and what we're witnessing unfold before our very eyes is that the most effective invasions in this era come not through tanks crossing borders, but through ideology crossing minds. What's happening between Mexico and the United States isn't just a matter of shifting political will. It's the result of a slow, quiet invasion of influence. No gunfire, no casualties, yet the effects may be even more destabilizing. This is control without confrontation, a new kind of war where silence isn't a pause, it's a tactic, and that's what makes this so difficult to detect. The quiet invasion works like a fog. It doesn't startle, it settles. It moves through trade agreements wrapped in generosity. It whispers through academic programs, infrastructure investments, and cultural exchanges that seem harmless at first glance. But behind the diplomacy lies something else, a redirection of values, a reassignment of loyalty. This is how modern influence works. It doesn't demand submission, it offers opportunity. It doesn't conquer by threat, it conquers by seduction. And if you don't recognize the method, you'll never question the motive. For years, Mexico has been positioned as a buffer, a nation strategically situated between the interests of the global South and the dominance of the North. The U.S. treated it like a partner, sometimes like a project, but rarely as a peer. And perhaps that oversight became an open door, because while American policymakers were busy managing crises elsewhere, other nations were building trust with Mexico in ways that weren't obvious, but were incredibly effective. Trust doesn't have to be loud to be strong. It just has to be consistent. And now the fruits of that consistency are beginning to show. China's presence in Latin America has grown steadily, methodically. It hasn't demanded loyalty. It's offered relief. Relief from dependency on Western financial systems. Relief from cultural pressure. Relief from conditions attached to aid. And in that relief, many nations, Mexico included, have started to wonder whether a new kind of allegiance could serve them better. Russia, on the other hand, plays a different hand. Its moves are psychological, its messaging designed to destabilize more than to build. But when combined, the strategies of both powers create something formidable, a framework that rewires how nations think, not just about policy, but about identity. That's why the submarine decision matters so much. It's not about submarines, it's about alignment, about where a nation turns when the pressure increases, about who it listens to when the old promises start to wear thin. And when Mexico, without a speech, without a press release, withdrew its cooperation, It revealed something that words never could. It revealed that influence had already shifted, not because it was forced, but because it was planted, nurtured, and allowed to grow quietly in the background. Like a weed among roots, it went unnoticed until it started choking out what had been there before. This is the kind of influence that governments aren't prepared to fight, because it doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't declare war. It doesn't even ask permission. It just walks in where truth has gone unguarded. It builds a home in the vacant spaces of conviction, and by the time you realize it's there, it's already influencing decisions, reshaping priorities, and bending loyalties. This is the quiet invasion, and it's not coming. It's here. But if we stop at politics, we miss the deeper point. This same strategy is being used on us every single day. In our homes, in our relationships, in our thought life. We're being influenced by forces we've stopped noticing. Algorithms shape our beliefs. Platforms define our values. Silence is sold as peace. Compromise is repackaged as progress. And while we've been looking for chaos, we've allowed subtle control to take root. The invasion didn't need to scream. It only needed us to stop listening. This is why spiritual alertness is no longer optional. We cannot afford to live passively in an era where influence moves like air, unseen but suffocating. We must ask deeper questions, not just about what we're seeing in the news, but what we're sensing in the spirit. Who's shaping the narrative? Who's redefining the terms? Who's benefiting from the silence? Because until we name the force, we won't resist it. And until we resist it, we're already under it. Mexico's decision is a wake-up call, not just for nations, but for every individual who thought their convictions were safe. Influence doesn't need your permission to enter. It only needs your attention to drift. And when it does, what you once stood for becomes negotiable. What you once believed becomes blurred. That's the quiet invasion. And it's not coming from the outside anymore. It's already inside the gate. If this message is revealing something to you, if you've started noticing how influence has crept into spaces you thought were secure, write the phrase, "I will guard the gate," in the comments. Or share how this concept of silent influence has shown up in your life or in the world around you. Let's name it, expose it, and stand against it, before what we think is ours no longer is. Prophetic tension. When nations become the battlefield for spiritual agendas, there's a moment in every great shift when you realize the battle you've been watching isn't just about land, policy, or alliances. It's about something far greater. It's about destiny, the kind that transcends headlines and speaks to the unseen architecture of history. What we're witnessing now with Mexico and the United States is not simply a breakdown in military cooperation. It's a moment of prophetic tension, a divine spotlight revealing that nations are not just political entities, but spiritual territories. And when those territories become unguarded or misaligned, they don't just drift, they become battlegrounds, not always with weapons, but with ideologies, with values, with spirits. The decisions being made at high levels right now are not just geopolitical, they are deeply spiritual, and it's time we begin to treat them that way. Mexico's withdrawal from supplying or assisting with strategic submarine components to the U.S. is a flashpoint, not because of its scale, but because of what it represents. A fracture in trust, a signal of reorientation, a quiet declaration that the future Mexico envisions for itself may not include the very neighbor with whom it shares a border, a history, and an economy. And while some might see this as a mere shift in foreign policy, those with discernment recognize it for what it truly is, a sign that the spiritual alignment of nations is changing. These aren't just alliances, they are agreements in the spirit. And when those agreements are broken, the ripple effects don't stay confined to defense budgets or bilateral summits. They flow into atmospheres. They affect the spiritual temperature of entire regions. What we're watching is more than a pivot. It's a contest for identity, for narrative, for future positioning in a world that's being redefined faster than most people can comprehend. And while world leaders scramble to retain control, something ancient is stirring. The kind of spiritual confrontation we read about in the Old Testament, where kings made treaties not just to protect their people, but to invite or resist divine blessing. Where prophets weren't political analysts, they were the voice of clarity in the midst of chaos. And make no mistake, clarity is what we lack right now. Not because the facts are unavailable, but because the fear of confronting uncomfortable truths has paralyzed our ability to discern. But here's what many don't realize. When a nation shifts its alignment, it opens a new gate in the spirit. That gate can invite blessing, protection, and prosperity, or it can invite confusion, compromise, and collapse. The laws of the unseen realm are just as real as the physical ones, and they are playing out right now across North America. Mexico, whether knowingly or not, is stepping into agreements that carry more than strategic implications. They carry spiritual weight. And the United States, long accustomed to assuming its influence by default, is facing the consequences of neglecting its role as a spiritual anchor in the hemisphere. Because influence isn't just about presence, it's about purpose. It's not enough to have the strongest navy if your foundation is eroding from within. It's not enough to build trade alliances if the moral compass of a nation is spinning in confusion. And this isn't just about national politics, it's about personal conviction. Because nations are made up of people, and the drift we're seeing in countries begins first in the hearts of individuals who stopped seeking truth and started tolerating compromise. That's why this battle is being fought on two fronts, externally in policy and internally in the soul. We have to ask ourselves some hard questions. What happens when a nation is no longer sure what it stands for? What fills the vacuum when conviction is replaced by convenience? And what forces step in when spiritual discernment is exchanged for diplomatic silence? These are not theoretical concerns. They are the very conditions that shape the future, and the longer we delay in confronting them, the more ground is quietly lost. Not in battles, but in belief systems. There's a reason the Bible describes nations as sheep and goats, because eventually every nation chooses a direction, toward truth or away from it. And every agreement made, every silence kept, every moral compromise entertained, is part of that decision-making process. What we're seeing now in the Mexico-US dynamic is not just a slow unraveling of military collaboration. It's a moment of spiritual clarity, if we choose to see it. A reminder that behind every negotiation, every pause, every redirection, there is a spiritual thread pulling at the destiny of a people. And maybe that's why you're watching this video. Because deep down, you've felt it too. The sense that something much bigger is unfolding. That this isn't just about ships and submarines, but about spiritual alignment. That this isn't just about Mexico or America. It's about the role we all play in the tension between truth and deception, clarity and confusion, obedience and resistance. The battle is real, and it's here. If you've felt this weight, this pull to look deeper, write the words, "I will stand in the tension" in the comments, or share how this moment is revealing to you the battle beyond the headlines. Your voice might be the light someone else needs to see through the fog. If you've made it this far, it means something in this message resonated deeply with your spirit. And now we want to hear from you. How did this video speak to your heart? Take a moment and leave a comment below saying, "I heard the voice of God in this video." And feel free to share how this message impacted you personally. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of truth, clarity, and spiritual awakening. Hit the like button if this content blessed you. It helps us reach more people with messages that matter. And most importantly, watch the next video already waiting for you on the end screen. There's more revelation, more direction, and more encouragement just ahead. May God bless your life powerfully, guide your steps with wisdom, and awaken your spirit to the times we are living in. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next video.